Prologue, November 3, 1943, Boxted Airfield, England. Master Sergeant Max Robert Coleman stood in the darkness of Hangar 4, his flashlight beam tracing the fuel tank seams of a P-47 Thunderbolt. Around him, the airfield slept. Above him, the corrugated metal roof rattled in the November wind that swept across Essex. But Max wasn't listening to the wind. He was listening to what the airplane was trying to tell him. His calloused fingers ran along the internal fuel tank's aluminum skin, feeling the slight bulge that shouldn't be there. 305 gallons internal capacity, the manual said. But the tank was telling a different story. Pressure deformation, wasted space, 15% inefficiency built into every bird the Republic Aviation Corporation had ever produced. Max pulled out his notebook, the same oil-stained spiral he'd carried since Brooklyn, and added another measurement to columns of data nobody had authorized him to collect. If he was right, and he knew he was right, he could give these Thunderbolts an extra 100 miles, maybe more. If he was wrong, he'd be court-martialed for unauthorized modification of military equipment. He clicked off the flashlight. Outside, the first bomber crews would be waking soon, preparing for another daylight raid deep into Germany, another mission where P-47 escorts would have to turn back at the border, leaving the B-17s to face the Luftwaffe alone. Another day when good men would die because their fighter cover ran out of gas 50 miles too soon. Max Coleman was a 34-year-old mechanic from Brooklyn who'd spent his life fixing cars, motorcycles, anything with an engine. He'd never designed an aircraft, never attended engineering school, never even graduated high school, but he was about to change the air war over Europe. Part 1. The Grease Monkey's education for the war. Max Coleman owned a garage on Flatbush Avenue. Coleman's Auto Repair, the sign read, honest work, fair prices. He could diagnose a bad carburetor by sound, rebuild a transmission blindfolded, and make a 20-year-old Ford run like new with spare parts and ingenuity. His education came from 10,000 broken engines, not textbooks. When something didn't work, Max didn't consult manuals. He got his hands dirty and figured it out. That approach, dismissed by formally trained engineers, would prove more valuable than any degree. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Max enlisted the next day, December 8, 1941. The Army looked at his age and experience and made him what he already was, a mechanic. By 1943, Master Sergeant Coleman found himself assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, maintaining the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at Boxted Airfield in England. The P-47 was a beast. At over 7 tons, fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, armed with 850 caliber machine guns, the Thunderbolt could dish out punishment and take it. Pilots loved its ruggedness. Enemy fire that would down other fighters barely scratched a P-47. But the Thunderbolt had one fatal flaw: range. With internal tanks holding 305 gallons, the P-47 could fly roughly 350 miles, fight for a few minutes, and return home. That meant escorts could barely reach the German border before turning back. The bombers continued alone into the heart of the Reich, where Luftwaffe fighters waited. The losses were catastrophic. On October 14, 1943, the Schweinfurt raid lost 60 B-17s, 60 bombers, 600 trained airmen in a single day. The mathematical reality was brutal. At this rate, the entire 8th Air Force Bomber Command would be eliminated before Germany's industrial capacity was destroyed. Part 2. The pattern in the metal. Max first noticed the fuel tank deformation in late October. After a long mission, he was performing routine post-flight inspection on aircraft number 428588, call sign Razorback. The internal fuel tank showed slight bulging along the upper seam. Standard procedure was to note it and move on. Metal fatigue, normal wear. But Max didn't move on. He measured the deformation, calculated the internal volume, compared it to the manufacturer's specifications. The numbers didn't match. Republic Aviation's technical manual specified 305 gallons internal capacity across 2 main tanks. But Max's measurements suggested the actual tank structure had space for nearly 350 gallons. The difference was safety margin, ventilation space, thermal expansion allowance, manufacturing tolerances. Engineers built in those margins deliberately. Fuel expands when heated. Tanks need ventilation. Tolerances prevent catastrophic failure. But Max saw something else. Wasted space that could save lives. He began systematic inspection of every P-47 in the squadron. Nights, when nobody was watching, he'd climb into fuel bays with measuring tape, calipers, and calculations. He documented tank dimensions, compared specifications to reality, and built a database of inefficiency. By early November, Max had identified 3 modifications that could increase fuel capacity without compromising safety. First, the ventilation system used oversized pipes, creating dead space. Smaller pipes with better routing would recover 15 gallons. Second, the tank mounting brackets created 6-inch gaps around the perimeter. Redesigned mounts could recover another 10 gallons. Third, and most radical, Max realized the fuselage had unused volume behind the pilot's seat. A B-25 Mitchell bomber had crashed near the airfield in September. Its auxiliary fuel tanks, sitting in salvage, were exactly the right size to fit that empty P-47 space. Total potential increase, 65 gallons, nearly 20% more fuel, an extra 100 miles of range. Max knew what he had to do. He also knew it was completely unauthorized. Part 3. The Midnight Modifications. On November 8, 1943, Max recruited 2 men he trusted absolutely, Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a welder from Pittsburgh, and Corporal Jimmy Reeves, an electrician from Atlanta. Both had worked under Max long enough to know his instincts were usually right. "I need you to not ask questions," Max told them in the corner of Hangar 4, away from other mechanics. "And I need you to understand we could all go to Leavenworth for this." Kowalski lit a cigarette. "What are we building, Sarge?" "We're fixing the P-47's range problem." For 3 nights, they worked after lights out. Max selected 3 aircraft scheduled for routine maintenance. Legitimate reasons to have them torn apart in the hangar. Aircraft 428622, 428635, and 428701. The work was meticulous. Kowalski fabricated new fuel line connections using salvaged B-25 parts. Reeves rewired fuel quantity indicators to account for the additional tank. Max personally modified the ventilation system, rerouting pipes through tighter paths, recovering every cubic inch. The B-25 auxiliary tanks fit perfectly into the fuselage space behind the pilot's seat, exactly as Max calculated. 65 gallons of additional capacity, just as predicted. They tested for leaks by filling tanks with colored water, checked ventilation by pressurizing the system, verified fuel flow rates matched specifications. Everything worked. By November 11th, 3 modified P-47s sat on the flight line, externally identical to every other Thunderbolt, but carrying fuel tanks that could fly them 100 miles deeper into Germany. Max had scheduled all 3 aircraft for the November 12th mission, long-range escort to Bremen. The pilots didn't know their birds had been modified. Max figured if something went catastrophically wrong, better it happened before anyone knew what he'd done. Part 4. The unauthorized Flight Lieutenant Robert Bob Anderson drew aircraft 42862 for the Bremen mission. A 23-year-old from Kansas, Anderson had 12 missions under his belt and a reputation as a steady, cautious pilot. The pre-flight briefing was standard. Escort bombers to Bremen, Maximum radius. Return before fuel critical. The 56th Fighter Group would provide cover to the German border, then turn back as fuel dictated. Anderson climbed into his cockpit at 0630, running through the familiar checklist. Everything normal. Engine start, oil pressure, fuel quantity, weight. The fuel gauge read higher than usual. Anderson tapped it, figuring the instrument was malfunctioning, but the needle stayed steady. Full internal tanks plus a bit extra showing on the auxiliary indicator. Strange, but not alarming. He'd mention it to the crew chief after landing. The formation launched at 0700, 80 P-47s escorting 230 B-17 flying fortresses toward Bremen's industrial targets. The plan called for escort coverage to the German border, approximately 300 miles from base. At 0830, as the formation crossed into German airspace, the fuel situation began looking odd to multiple pilots. Standard procedure at this point was to monitor fuel carefully, preparing to turn back within 15 minutes. But Anderson's fuel gauges showed reserves. He'd never seen this far into a mission. His wingman radioed, "Lead, you seeing your fuel numbers? I've got 20 minutes more than I should." Back at Boxted, the duty officer received a routine radio check from the bomber formation. Then came an unusual transmission from the fighter group commander. Base, the 56th, is showing unexplained fuel reserves. Request confirmation of loadout specifications for today's aircraft. The message reached the operations officer, who checked the morning's fuel truck logs. Everything normal. 305 gallons per aircraft, standard load. By 0900, the situation escalated. The operations officer noticed something in the aircraft assignment roster. 3 planes assigned to the mission had recently undergone maintenance. Aircraft 428622, 428635, and 428701. He walked to Hangar 4 and found Master Sergeant Coleman calmly drinking coffee. "Sergeant, what maintenance did you perform on those 3 birds?" Max set down his cup. This was it. Court-martial or vindication. "Fuel system modifications, sir. Increased capacity, approximately 65 gallons per aircraft." "You did what?" The officer's voice carried across the hangar. "Modified the fuel tanks. Night before last. The birds are safe, sir. Tested everything twice. But those pilots have an extra 100 miles in them." "You modified military aircraft without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "You could be shot for sabotage." "Yes, sir, but those boys won't have to turn back today." Part 5. The transmission. While Max Coleman faced arrest at Boxted, Lieutenant Anderson was discovering what an extra 100 miles meant. At 0915, the standard fuel warning point, Anderson's P-47 still showed comfortable reserves. His flight continued escort duties while other P-47 squadrons reluctantly turned for home, their fuel gauges approaching critical. By 0930, Anderson's flight was the only American fighter presence over the bomber stream. 68 B-17s protected by exactly 12 P-47s that somehow still had fuel. At 0945, the Luftwaffe arrived, 30 Messerschmitt Me-109 fighters diving from altitude, expecting undefended bombers. Instead, they found Thunderbolts that shouldn't exist this deep in Germany. Anderson's combat report, filed later that day, captured the moment. Enemy fighters appeared shocked to encounter P-47s 150 miles inside Germany. Their standard tactic of waiting for escorts to leave before attacking was disrupted. We engaged immediately. 2 Me-109s destroyed. 1 probable. 0 friendly bomber losses during our coverage period. The radio transmission Anderson sent at 1,000 hours would become legendary in 8th Air Force history. Base, blue flight still on station. Fuel sufficient for 30 additional minutes coverage, plus safe return. Enemy fighters breaking off. Request confirmation. Did someone change our fuel capacity? At Boxted, the operations room erupted. The duty officer grabbed the radio. "Blue flight, confirm your fuel status. Repeat, confirm fuel status." "Confirmed. We're showing reserves impossible with standard tanks. These birds have extra juice somehow." The operations officer turned to Max Coleman, now under guard by 2 MPs. "Sergeant, how much fuel did you add?" 65 gallons, sir. They can fight another 20 minutes and still make it home." Part 6. The inspection. By the time Anderson's flight landed at 11:45, Boxted Airfield was in controlled chaos. The group commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, a hard-driving fighter leader who would finish the war as a German POW with 17.75 victories, had grounded all 3 modified aircraft pending investigation. 2 engineers from Republic Aviation had been summoned from the company's liaison office. A team from 8 Fighter Command Technical Services was en route. Max Coleman sat in the Provost Marshal's office, technically under arrest for unauthorized modification of military equipment. The inspection began immediately. Republic Aviation's chief field engineer, a man named Howard Pierce, examined Coleman's modifications with growing fascination. Pierce had designed some of the P-47's original fuel systems. He knew every specification, every tolerance, every safety margin built into the design. As he traced Coleman's modifications, his expression shifted from skepticism to grudging respect. The ventilation rerouting was brilliant, tighter clearances than Republic would have specified, but perfectly functional and actually improving venting efficiency. The auxiliary tank installation used B-25 components in ways Pierce had never considered, but the engineering was sound. After 2 hours, Pierce emerged from Hangar 4 and requested an immediate meeting with Colonel Zemke. "Colonel, I need to be honest. This sergeant's modifications are unorthodox, unauthorized, and—" Pierce paused. "Absolutely genius. He's increased fuel capacity 21% without compromising a single safety system. The structural integrity is maintained. Fuel flow rates are actually improved. I've been designing fuel systems for 15 years, and I didn't see what he saw." Zemke studied the engineer. "You're telling me a garage mechanic from Brooklyn out-engineered Republic Aviation?" "I'm telling you he saw what we missed because he wasn't constrained by our assumptions. We built safety margins into everything." Coleman looked at those margins and asked, "How much of this is actually necessary?" "Turns out, not as much as we thought." The 8 Fighter Command Inspector, a lieutenant colonel named Patterson, was less impressed. Regardless of effectiveness, Sergeant Coleman conducted unauthorized modifications of military equipment in wartime. That's a court-martial offense. He could have killed 3 pilots if something failed. "But nothing failed," Zemke noted, "and Lieutenant Anderson's flight saved an estimated 15 B-17s today by providing extended coverage. That's 150 men who came home because Coleman's modifications worked." The debate raged for an hour. Engineer perspectives versus military regulations, combat effectiveness versus procedural compliance, innovation versus discipline. Then a call came through from 8 Bomber Command Headquarters. General Jimmy Doolittle wanted to speak directly with Colonel Zemke. Part 7. Doolittle's Gamble. Lieutenant General James Jimmy Doolittle had commanded the 8th Air Force for less than a year, but his impact was already transforming Allied air strategy. The man who led the famous Tokyo raid in 1942 understood both the technical and human sides of air combat better than almost anyone. Doolittle's call to Zemke was brief. "Hub, I've been briefed on your sergeant's fuel modifications. Here's the situation. We're losing this air war. October 14th, we lost 60 bombers. Last week, 43. We can't sustain these losses. If your mechanic can give us 100 more miles of escort range, that changes everything. How fast can he modify your entire group? Zemke glanced at Max Coleman, still sitting under guard. Sir, he's currently facing court-martial. Then unarrest him and put him to work. I'm issuing a direct order. Master Sergeant Coleman will modify every P-47 in the 56th Fighter Group within 72 hours. If he succeeds, I'll recommend him for the Legion of Merit. If he fails, he can go to Leavenworth with my personal apology. But right now, Hub, he's our best chance to keep our bomber crews alive. Zemke hung up and walked to the Provost Marshal's office. Sergeant Coleman, you're released. You have 3 days to modify 48 aircraft. Can you do it? Max stood, rubbing his wrists where the MPs had held him. Yes, sir, but I'll need help, and I'll need the squadron grounded during modifications. Can't do this piecemeal. You'll have every mechanic in the group. General Doolittle just gave you carte blanche. Don't make us regret it. Part 8, 72 hours. What followed was the most intense 3 days in 56th Fighter Group history. Max divided the work into teams. Kowalski led fuel line modifications. Reeves handled electrical rewiring. Max personally supervised auxiliary tank installations, the most critical and dangerous part. They worked in shifts, 16 hours on, 8 hours off. Hot coffee and cigarettes kept mechanics awake. The salvaged B-25 tanks were supplemented by emergency shipments of auxiliary tanks. Republic Aviation rushed from the States. Republic's engineer Pierce stayed to advise, but increasingly, he simply watched Max work, taking notes. We're going to incorporate these modifications into production models, Pierce told Max during a midnight coffee break. You're rewriting our engineering specifications. By hour 48, 24 aircraft were modified. By hour 60, 38. The work went faster as mechanics learned the procedures. On November 15th at 1600 hours, 72 hours and 12 minutes after Doolittle's order, Max walked into Zemke's office, hands black with grease, eyes red from exhaustion. All 48 birds are done, sir. Everyone tested and certified. You can fly tomorrow. Zemke studied the man who'd just worked 3 days straight. Get some sleep, Sergeant. Tomorrow we're going to find out if you just won the air war over Europe. Part 9. The Mission to Osnabrück. November 16, 1943. Mission 148. Target, Osnabrück, Germany. Deep penetration, 450 miles from base. Previously impossible for P-47 escort. 48 modified Thunderbolts launched at 0800. Every pilot had been briefed on the new fuel capacity. Some were skeptical. Most were hopeful. All understood the stakes. The bomber stream consisted of 174 B-17s hitting industrial targets. Intelligence indicated heavy Luftwaffe presence. This would be a meat grinder if fighters couldn't provide coverage all the way to the target. The formation crossed into Germany at 0920. Usually this was when P-47s turned back. Today they kept going. At 1000, Luftwaffe fighters appeared. 20 Me-109s diving from altitude, expecting undefended bombers. Instead, they found the sky still full of Thunderbolts. The ensuing dogfight lasted 15 minutes. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 11 enemy fighters destroyed, 4 probables. 0 bombers lost to fighters during the P-47 coverage period. At 10:15, with the target in sight and bombers releasing ordnance, the P-47 still had enough fuel to remain on station. By 10:30, the bombers were turning for home, mission complete. The P-47s provided coverage until 1100, then turned back themselves, fuel gauges showing reserves that would have been impossible a week earlier. The entire strike force returned to base with the lowest loss rate of any deep penetration mission in 8th Air Force history. 3 bombers lost to flak, 0 to fighters. That evening, Colonel Zemke sent a simple message to General Doolittle. Mission successful. Coleman's modifications work. Recommend immediate implementation across 8 fighter command. Part X. The Revolution Doolittle's response was swift. Within a week, Republic Aviation engineers were at every P-47 base in England, training mechanics in Coleman's modifications. Within a month, every Thunderbolt in the 8th Air Force carried the extended range fuel system. The impact on the air war was immediate and profound. Missions that had been suicide runs became achievable. Luftwaffe tactics, built around waiting for escorts to leave, collapsed. American bomber losses dropped from 20% to less than 5% on escorted missions. By January 1944, Coleman's modifications had been incorporated into production at Republic's factories. The P-47D-25, rolling off assembly lines in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, included the fuel system improvements as standard equipment. Republic Aviation offered Max a job as a consulting engineer. His response, "I'm a mechanic, not an engineer, and my boys need me here." On February 3, 1944, General Doolittle personally flew to Boxted to present Master Sergeant Max Robert Coleman with the Legion of Merit. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services in developing fuel system modifications that dramatically increased the combat effectiveness of P-47 aircraft, directly contributing to the success of strategic bombing operations over occupied Europe." The ceremony was brief. Doolittle pinned the medal, shook Max's hand, and said, "Sergeant, you changed this war. Never doubt that." Max's response was pure Brooklyn. "Just listen to what the airplanes were telling me, sir. Somebody had to." Epilogue. September 1958, Cleveland Air Races. 15 years after the war, Max Coleman stood at the Cleveland Air Races, watching restored P-47's Thunder past. He'd returned to Brooklyn after the war, reopened his garage, lived quietly. A man approached, German accent, 60s, walking with a cane. "Excuse me, are you Max Coleman, the mechanic?" "Used to be. You are?" "Major Friedrich Faulkner, Luftwaffe. Retired, obviously." The German smiled. "I flew Me-109s over Germany in 1943 and 44. You're the man who modified the P-47 fuel tanks, yes?" "That was me." Faulkner watched the Thunderbolts roar past. "We couldn't understand it. Suddenly, American escorts appeared 200 kilometers deeper than ever before. Our entire defensive strategy assumed distance, protected us. Then your Thunderbolts showed up everywhere. Changed the war, they tell me. Changed everything." Faulkner extended his hand. "I lost friends to those modified P-47s, but I wanted to meet the man who did it. Most innovations come from engineers with degrees. Yours came from a garage mechanic who trusted his hands more than blueprints." They shook hands, old enemies finding common ground in technical respect. "How did you see it?" Faulkner asked. "What did trained engineers miss?" Max smiled. "They designed to specifications. I fixed what was broken. To me, wasted space is broken. They saw safety margins. I saw boys dying because fighters turned back too soon. Different perspective, that's all." Faulkner nodded slowly. The war was full of brilliant weapons designed by brilliant men. But sometimes the most important innovations come from someone who just sees a problem and fixes it, regardless of what the manual says. A restored P-47 climbed steeply, sunlight catching its polished aluminum skin. Both men watched, remembering when those same aircraft met in skies over Germany. "You know what Republic never understood?" Max said quietly. "Those fuel tanks were trying to tell them something from day one. Pressure deformations, inefficient venting. The airplanes were practically begging for modifications. I just listened." "And that," Faulkner replied, "is why mechanics win wars and engineers design them." They stood together, watching history fly circles in the Ohio sky. Proof that sometimes the most important innovations come not from drafting tables and wind tunnels, but from grease-stained hands that know how to listen to what machines are really saying.